Welcome, everybody, to Stories We Share, Crafting Game Narratives for Change. My name is Jenny Wyndham, and I'll be the moderator for today's LudoNarraCon panel, where we discuss how games, in addition to providing hours of fun and engagement, can also inspire players to reflect and perhaps even take action in the real world. Before we jump into that, though, I have some exciting people with me to talk about this subject. So let's take a moment to meet each of our panelists. We'll start with Pico, then go on to Tanya, then Kara. But would each of you be able to introduce your name, pronouns, and a little bit about what you're currently working on?
Hi, I'm Pico, they, them, and I'm the solo developer of Garden Story, a village sim action RPG centered around helping communities.
Awesome. My name is Tanya Kan. I go by she, her pronouns, and my game is Solace State, a 3D visual novel about young hackers who speak truth to power in a biotech surveillance state.
And I'm Kara Hillstock. My pronouns are she, her. And most relevant to this panel, I made a game called To Be With You, which is a semi-autobiographical novel about abusive relationships, and also an as yet unnamed game with the nonprofit Embrace Race that discusses structural racism's impact on COVID-19.
I just got goosebumps because this is just so cool. Yeah. Woo. So again, and I realized I forgot to mention my pronouns. I'm Jenny again, and I use she, her pronouns. So for everyone watching, please look up these titles. Please look up each of these people, wishlist them, purchase the games. They're all great titles you should support. So each of you are working on a game or multiple games that intentionally dives a bit deeper. I guess we can start with any one of you, but what inspired you to create games that, in addition to being fun, do address more substantial topics?
I ended up creating To Be With You. I thought of the idea for it about 4 or 5 years ago. And for me, it was really important to try and create the experience of getting into a relationship that's becoming unhealthier over time, because I feel like as much as I read about that stuff before I ended up getting into an abusive relationship, I didn't see the parallels. And I felt like that needed to be more of a lived experience in order to really understand what that looks like when it's happening. And so I felt games were the best way to achieve that.
Yeah, I think just like lived experiences in general really draws us to what we can experience in games and like what kind of experiences we can give to other people. And I think drawing on those personal experiences is really important when getting into games and like trying to put forth a message.
Yeah, I think for myself, activism and social impact has been such a big part of just what I want to know and learn more about in the world. And so when I was a child, I had such a hard time articulating that. So I feel like I'm almost making games that I would have wanted to see more of. I'm not saying that there aren't games like this, because there are so many great developers who are also creating this kind of content. But for myself, it's a way of articulating that feeling of never being able to do enough. Like, I feel like I can't look away from the inequalities, even if I like wanted to. That's the wrong way of saying it, but like it's so hard to compartmentalize sometimes, even if I really wanted to learn more. And so it gives me the opportunity to talk to activists around the world and to engage and to see how I can reflexively strive to be better and more responsible as a human being, I guess. Yeah, so I wanted to also understand a lot more about how people put themselves on the line for their causes. In different configurations around the world, that even despite the specificity of their own localities that they're addressing in their activism, how does that relate to more shared values amongst everyone as human beings? So that was something that I just really wanted to understand more of and to explore that philosophy. And I think it's kind of like an ongoing, just lifelong journey for me.
I think one point that you all brought up in sort of different ways was the idea of lived experiences and how that's informing what you are creating. I think games are really interesting because someone who is playing your game may not have those lived experiences. So what are some of the challenges when you're creating these stories that are so meaningful and impactful based on what you've experienced and what you're learning and growing with, and knowing that your audience may not have those lived experiences?
It's a constant struggle for me constantly to like balance the medium of the game with the message that I'm trying to create, because I feel like a lot of people go into games with the idea that it has to be a fun experience and they expect to be rewarded on common levels. But I think trying to push forward ideas that are are channeled by our need for social change is always hard, because we're addressing inequalities, and I think trying to gamify that is really hard sometimes, honestly.
It's definitely such a challenge, I think, and I like to throw myself headlong into at least this type of challenge. And I think, to not shame someone who hasn't undergone my grief or guilt or shame is something that I am trying to use my articulation and my art to make a little bit more universalizing without like eroding what's quintessentially my experience. So like I'm thinking sometimes in broad strokes of, okay, human conditions of like what hurts and what makes us human and what heals us, without like encouraging almost like kind of reducing myself down to just my trauma, because that kind of perspective can be also very re-traumatizing and really dangerous. So it's always been this balance of how can I articulate it and how can I speak up more about it without speaking over somebody as well. That's also something that I'm cognizant of as I'm designing. So
Yeah, I really agree. There's a very kind of delicate balance between kind of what you're wanting to put in the game and what you're wanting to communicate to the player and how they might be responding to what you're putting in, because you want them to have an enjoyable and safe and healthy experience, but you also want to, at least for me, I want to make sure that the emotional weight of the experience is what carries over, because I feel like it's that emotional experience of going through this game, going through this experience that really stays with people and that teaches them the lessons. Whereas potentially, leaning too heavily into the gameplay or the fun might obfuscate that a little bit. So there's always this delicate balancing act of trying to get what you want to get across, but not trying to take away from the player's experience.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that really resonates with me. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Go ahead, Tanya.
There is this overemphasis I'm kind of hopefully adding to this with, there is an overemphasis on fun over meaning that I think even early on in my career, I've really had to be like, well, why can't we just have meaningful emotional experiences in games, rather than like the first prototype always has to be fun. And sometimes this doesn't even have to do with like innovation with like new ways of showing aesthetically or in terms of new game mechanics, but it's just has to resonate with somebody. And I think that's already more than enough. That could be another metric of a good game, for example, if one wants to get into the kind of
fully agree. Agree.
I think like drawing from personal experience, it's hard to gamify that specifically because players want agency, but when you're drawing from personal experience, you kind of you're dealing with things from personal perspective, and trying to guide a player through the same decisions that you made or like the same views that you have can be a little bit hard when players expect to represent themselves sometimes in games and the way that they play them.
Yeah, that's a really good point that I have tangentially thought about. But the idea of when players jump into games, them expecting to role play as themselves versus role playing as the characters, you hope that they have maybe they can put themselves in their shoes for a little bit. Exactly. Now, one thing that I think is really interesting is as a medium, games, and we've touched on this, but they allow audiences to interact in very different ways than if they're reading a pamphlet about a topic, watching a movie, or reading a book or a TV show. So what are some of those inherent benefits that as you're creating your games that you find come with the medium?
I think like mechanically, you can just design like rewards for players, and like it doesn't super matter how relevant it is to the story, but players, depending on the medium and genre, will want certain things, and you can make them fight for those and like give them conflict that's relevant to that.
I think for Solace State, having an interactive system makes a lot of sense because we're talking about stewardship regarding democratizing systems, and political systems. And what are your kind of menu of choices when you're influencing a political system without actually being part of state actors? So, what can non-state actors do? It's, of course, created a number of challenges, writing branching narratives, but at the same time, it's a lot of fun to see, like, at least what are the menu of available actions without necessarily going into, like, military-industrial complex violence, specifically, like, you know, you're running and gunning with guns, I guess.
And I think stories have always been interactive. It's just not necessarily been as in your face as it is with games. And so games bring out that aspect of storytelling. And I think that, like, in To Be With You's case, the agency of the main character, Alcy, who is the one who is going through this abusive relationship, is crucially important to understanding the dynamics that happen in unhealthy relationships and how that agency kind of starts to slip away from you, starts to seem like it's not actually there. So the interactive aspect of games and being able to present the player with choices that seemed to have agency, but maybe they didn't, or sometimes they did, but not in the way that you intended, was really important to getting that experience across.
Yeah.
So we've talked about some of those like challenges that can come with, you know, with the medium, with the audience, and trying to convey these messages. But as you are creating these games, I imagine you're reinvestigating these topics, you're finding new ways to talk about them. Has anything in particular come very easily when translating things to games? And has your relationship changed with the topic that you're trying to broach?
Yeah, I feel like it has for me. I'm really pleasantly surprised by how it resonates with people when I talk about it, such that it crosses borders. And that's basically been my hope and goal all along, that it's not just like down to like, oh, you know, I'm from Canada and this is like only Canadians will understand it for whatever reason, or like Asian Americans will understand this game. So the more that happened, the more I feel comfortable talking about the game, and I discovered a joy in talking about this game without realizing that I actually like being in front of the camera or going to shows to do this sort of thing. So it was something that I've had to discover, and also just the joy of working with narrative consultants and cultural consultants is quite frankly, now I feel like game development has been such a great excuse to do that, like over and over again, to be like, well, but I think this might work towards the, you know, the diegesis of the game, and how can we include this in so that it's much more culturally reflexive, and because, you know, I can't be in all places to understand every single subject position. So yeah, that's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think looking for demographics and like making sure that like what you're making is representative of your culture and and resonates with the same people, I feel like I'm always going back to make sure that whatever I'm talking about or representing is actually authentic. And I think honestly that's an endless hallway. Like authenticity is just not truly attainable on that level. But I don't know. I think at a certain point you just have to be okay with representing whatever means the most to you and like what you want to see in games.
Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of research that we all put into really trying to understand the topics that we choose, and reading like research papers and talking to people who are experts in their fields and really know and understand what's going on, and having to translate that then into an experience that hopefully accurately represents everything that you've learned. I think it's kind of hard not to be impacted by that process. For as much as I knew about COVID-19 and how structural racism has been impacting it, it wasn't until Embrace Race gave me access to all of the research that they've done on prison populations and on undocumented workers and on all of the different aspects of our population and how they've been affected by COVID that I hadn't seen. And I had thought I was doing a good job of keeping up with everything, but there was so much more detail and nuance, and you really want to get the humanity behind the research into the experience that you're creating. So I think it's really hard not to be changed by that.
Yeah, there's honestly just a lot happening right now, and I think it's kind of impossible to keep up with all of it. But I think, yeah, representing other people in our community is also really hard, and the academic look is always important, and like translating that to their lived experiences also is hard. And that's not even mentioning that this is something that's actively happening to us right now. And, doing research in those circles and trying to form an opinion while it's currently actively happening is extremely hard.
Yeah. It's a good challenge that I feel like I need to participate in any little way possible. And I do think I am participating in a little way. It's like, on the one hand, it's so good to be able to get to know people in a really, what I said earlier wasn't fully encapsulated of that kind of complexity. But sometimes it's also like a lot to unpack, and especially during like the script writing process. So I think in recognizing oppression, while like my previous background in political science gave me a more distant lens for sure, like there's qualitative analysis, but there's also quantitative analysis, and that gives a kind of very macro lens, no matter how you look at it, compared to like firsthand like interview processes. And so like I feel like I need to really step away sometimes and make sure that myself and other people on my team has some downtime, similar to activists. Really, activists also need that sort of downtime.
Right. So games, I think I'm pretty sure I can say that all of us tend to play games or have played games that involve that level of emotional impact, messaging that involves social change. Like, I think a lot of us are drawn to those kind of games, but I also feel like that's a little bit of a bubble, and that maybe in the consumer world, or people who aren't as familiar with games in the game industry, they might not see games as a medium that addresses change or strives to foster change at all. Why do you think that is the case? And maybe what are some of the ways that maybe that's not the case?
Ooh, that's a rough one.
That's a rough one.
I don't want to step on any toes here, but I think it's often easier to appeal to a cultural bias in many ways, and I feel like what really fuels a lot of game devs is the need to like challenge that, though that's not going to be normal for like people who have already established themselves, I guess.
there's definitely just the concept that games are fun and that that's all they're really meant to be. And so much of our media is escapism. And like I tend to consume mostly escapist media because my work tends to involve really heavy topics. And I think that that becomes even more the case when we're all in such a awful time right now that most people are wanting to turn away from the complexities of the world in their media and find a way to escape everything that's happening. And I think that that tendency just manifests itself across most people's tastes. And so it requires giving it a shot. It requires being willing to open yourself up and having that emotional energy to open yourself up to play an experience that is going to make you feel and is going to be really, really worth it in the end and have a big impact on you, but might not be the kind of like fun, I just want to relax and turn my brain off experience that most people expect when they come to games.
I think, yeah, I completely agree. There's such a separation between educational games, like what's marketed as educational games, what gets funding as educational games, and just the whole entire market for that in terms of industry, and that of like the fun commercial games. And there's also like that conceptual separation as well. And then on top of that, there is something in between all of this, which is the military-industrial complex spin-off of adapting a lot of those training protocols from first-person shooters and first-person, the other way around. Adapting basically wartime simulation into first-person shooters. And I think and remarketing that as fun takes quite a lot of marketing power, industrial power, and a lot of money. So, and I think there's a lot into emphasizing those innovative mechanics specifically from simulation and military simulation into fun as well. So.
It's really the power, like as you're saying, the power of the marketing has really kind of changed what we see as fun. In a lot of ways, if you don't have some kind of combat mechanics somewhere in your game, there's a lot of people who don't grasp it immediately. It's just such a new paradigm still, I think, for the wider audience of casual gamers to find fun in something that doesn't have an immediate model for conflict, which isn't to say that there's not a ton of really successful games out there that don't use conflict as a main medium, but that's still kind of the primary expected way right now.
Yeah, violence is immediately understandable to a gamer, and it's not to say that it doesn't have its place in games, but I think when people aren't fighting something, it can be harder for them to grasp like the weight of what they're trying to do. And I feel like as a greater concept, like the stories that we tell about violence and like how we perceive it as a society definitely plays into like what kind of ways violence is shown within games, especially where power fantasies are pretty much the norm.
Exactly. The hero complex is a big part of that as well. I think that plays into it. And the reward system. Actually, that's something Vika, you brought up earlier, so I feel like I'm riffing off of that. So,
yeah, and that kind of is a really nice segue to sort of the idea of what else, in addition to the narrative, and we're primarily focusing on how the stories can create the change, but games aren't simply stories, they're not simply art, they're not simply mechanics, they're the sum of their parts with how players experience them. So as you're creating your games, how do the mechanics play a factor into sort of the message you're trying to convey and what you want the players to do and actually physically sort of embody as they're interacting with your narrative?
Tough ones, Jenny.
I know. I know y'all can take it, so.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question again? I want to make sure I can answer it properly.
Absolutely. So
Same.
when you're creating a game, how do the mechanics also play into how the story is conveying or conveyed? Or the values?
I can connect this a little bit with our visual style as well, if that's okay. Solace State does this kind of trippy diegetic text 3D space, but it is a visual novel element with choices. And so we kind of try to show obfuscation and transparency as the camera basically runs through buildings, and there's clipping as almost like a hacky state of things. And we really wanted to portray like digital information and the obfuscation, or the inverse of that, the translucency of information during this complex political time, but make it make it allegorical. And so like the idea that no matter how willing we are to fight for something, there's still like imperfect information. No one has like 100% access to information and can rationalize everything. It's not just along those kind of dimensions. It's also along the dimensions of emotions and what your personal experiences bring to the field. So we really want to emphasize that for characters who become activists. They didn't start off as activists, for example. They aren't just born as activists. And then that kind of cutaway hack transitions kind of show a privileged way of accessing information, but at the same time, preconceived biases are also put into the content of the writing as well. And combining with that, we really try to use 3D like speech bubbles that are in the world. So when you're actually playing the game, the camera moves alongside with you, and the speech bubbles are very much attached to the 3D game world, and it's very inspired by comics. So that aspect of it is almost like the textual information, the things that people say, the rumors and so forth, to their political opinions, they don't exist in a bubble. So we really want to try to like emphasize that space and time, build upon basically political opinion, political information, what becomes status quo and so forth.
It's really cool.
Also, to add to that answer, I want to pivot to a different game that I'm currently working on called Pride versus Prejudice, a competitive multiplayer novel. And in that game, all of our decisions are made almost in service of the narrative, because the narrative is inherently the gameplay. And so we were trying to create an experience that would function well for couch co-op, for when you're playing the game with somebody else in the room. And so all of the decisions that were made for the game were about envisioning how these two people might interact with each other and interact with the story through being in the same room, through maybe withholding some information or telling someone that you did something that you didn't actually do, or obfuscating which choice you're making within the game. Whoa. And so I think that as far as tying like gameplay and art and music and narrative all together, it's ultimately about picturing how you're wanting people to go through the game, what feelings you're wanting them to have, what kind of dynamic you're wanting there to exist between multiple players even, and as much as you can, trying to build everything to form a cohesive whole. So whatever meaning you're wanting to get across or experience you're wanting to get across, combining everything, much in the way that Tanya was describing, is how you get that across, I think.
Yeah. I think for me, it's mostly like recontextualizing the mechanics rather than making new ones to tell my story. I think in every survival crafting game, like it's all about like coming to a new land and building stuff and ultimately carving out the space that's already there for your own. And while I'm really drawn personally to those kinds of game mechanics, I always thought the narrative of that at its basis is grounded in a lot of colonialism. But Garden Story is very much not about carving out new land, but repairing what's already there. And I think even with systems like violence, or like combat systems, drawing from a lot of unhealthy cultural bias, I think there still is a place for violence, and like and speaking truth to like the healthy ways that violence can do things for us is important, especially in today's world where people are fighting out in the streets all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Can
I think
you first. Sorry.
I think that thinking about like games really thrive on conflict, and a lot of times we represent that conflict in terms of physical, real violence, whereas in this world of Pride and Prejudice, if you're familiar at all with like the time period where those books take place, a lot of the conflict and fighting and like reputation, like a lot of what went on there was just words. It was rumors, it was insults, it was back and forths, it was framing things so that people would think what you wanted them to think. And I think that taking conflict and packaging it into different ways will still be just as familiar to a player, but it doesn't necessarily have to be explicit violence.
Yeah. Especially now when we have so many different kinds of genres with their own takes on violence, you can almost repackage like RPG systems to use like combat systems in a completely non-violent context. And I think that's also another fun way to recontextualize things.
That is so much fun. And there's definitely a market for it. I think also the emphasis on like, where can choice systems give us that aren't just direct forms of violence, I think is really interesting. So for Solace State, we're looking at it from a contextualization of like the personal is political, with our it's not only it's not an all-female cast, but definitely there are a lot more non-men on the cast of the game than as per usual if there's usually a political game. So with that, it's like sometimes you'll say something of which has unintended consequences. You'll make certain choices in our game that has unintended consequences. And there are oftentimes like you don't necessarily know what reputational costs might be, where you can generate certain kind of direction of movements and so forth. So we're trying to obviously not create like a sense of anything goes kind of chaos at the same time. So that's one of our challenges. But also have certain reveals that would be surprising but rewarding at the same time, given the choices that you made. So that's what we're going with. And yeah, those choices in terms of like, when you treat people well on a one-to-one individual basis might actually have consequences beyond that if someone else is watching and so forth. So everyone has an opinion.
We're getting close to the end of our time together, so I think I have time for maybe one or maybe two more questions. One thing that I wanted to ask is that, you know, addressing or games that address heavier topics are becoming a bit more prominent in the industry. It's something that more developers are exploring, but just having a more substantial narrative topic in your game doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting your audience to reflect or inspiring them to change or really getting them to take any sort of action. And so I'm curious, what can narrative designers or game designers do, or if you have examples, what have they done to get players to move past just consuming a story and letting it be a story and actually starting to take it into the real world and into their own lived experiences a little bit more?
I would say actable information, like just give them what they need to know, and if they can stew on it for a really long time, then they'll eventually act, I'd like to think. it doesn't necessarily need to be like one-to-one true information. You can recontextualize information within a game to make sense within the story, even if it's fictional. But even for things like understanding unhealthy power dynamics, that's integral to conflict in narrative games.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I think the complexity of fictional narratives sometimes is just sediments, right? You read more of things that are reflexive of society. You feel compelled to seek more of that out. You feel compelled to be more critical, or to take a critical lens at some of the, for example, power dynamics or inequality that's being displayed. I think any game or even just broader entertainment media that can demonstrate that is super powerful. The more, I think, like direct examples I can think of would be actually a game that you've mentioned before, which is Never Alone. Sorry, you being Jenny, you've mentioned before, being Never Alone, and they embedded real documentary footage that was such a reward that I very much look forward to that at the end of each chapter in the game, to illustrate Indigenous experiences and to contextualize what you're experiencing in the story is actually something of which still has a lot of cultural weight and are based on lived experience as well. So I think that's really powerful.
And for me, I'm gonna hit the same note that I did before with, I think that it's a lot about the emotions and creating a world where that feels real, where you can empathize with the experiences that the characters are having. And I think that takes a lot of like real honesty to be able to portray characters' experience and the player's experience with them so honestly that they're able to make themselves vulnerable and empathize with what's going on and reflect maybe on how, like, if they feel bad that a character went through something that they didn't mean for them to reflect on what they did that caused that to happen. I also think that there's a little bit of a chance, I think, for designers to include resources in the menu or as unlocktables, like with the documentary footage. I think that you can give people further reading afterwards, that if they are interested, if the topic has piqued their interest, then they can click on some links and go educate themselves and find action steps too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. For all the research that we do, there's never been a footnote I've seen in a game, unfortunately.
To be with you,
Analog
Yeah,
Oh,
there we go.
Yeah, I remember Analog Hate Story having one footnote.
Oh,
Which is really nice.
That's
yeah.
a really
By
good game
Christine
too.
Yeah, that
Yes.
is a very good game.
Yeah, and I guess like tips for narrative designers is just consulting people at different intersections if they want to create more narratively reflexive titles, and not just one person from what ethnicity if they can help it, or one intersection, but like try to get an overlap, because like no one's a monolith of like this is representation, but representation matters so much. Just being able to see a character with agency from a marginalized community, I think, helps a lot, and not having bad endings all the time.
Yes.
That was a lot of
power and joy too. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a
Yes,
lot of
some happy
checklists. I just realized.
That's a really good point. Now we're at the end of this panel. There are so many other questions that I wish I could ask, but we'll just have to come back next LudoNarraCon or something. Bring it back. So thank you for everyone who stopped by to listen to this panel. Again, each of these developers and so many others who aren't on this panel, they're working to fuse real-world experiences, storytelling, and their game design to create these unique experiences that as a player you can experience and potentially, hopefully, take into your into your world. So I hope you check out all of their work. Once again, let's do quick introductions, who you are. I guess it's not an introduction, reintroduction. So folks can remember where to find you and what you're working on. And just for fun, to shake it up, let's start with Kara and then move to Tanya and then Pico. So where can folks find you? What are you working on?
Well, I'm Kara Hillstock. I'm a narrative designer. You can find me on Twitter at Cheratomo, Cheratomo. And you can also find the games that I work on at illuseed.com, ILLUSSEED.com. And I'm currently working on Pride versus Prejudice, a competitive multiplayer novel, and Onsen Master.
I'm so excited.
So good.
Yeah, Tanya.
Hello, I'm Tanya, Tanya Can. You can find me at Vivid Foundry, so VIVID, Found, RY. I feel like that's the easiest way to say it. On Twitter, on Instagram, on Twitch. Those are all places where we're pretty active. And we have a Discord channel as well, Solace State no, that's not the URL. Anyways, I'll link it when we're active. We also have our game on Steam. So if you look up Solace State, you'll be able to find it. For this week only, we'll have the demo available for download, so for a limited time. So please have a chance to check it out if you can. Maybe if you think it's something you're excited about. And after this week, it won't be available anymore. But yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for all of this. Yes.
Woo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pico.
I'm Pico. My Twitter handle is picogram_art. And my Garden Story handle is Garden Story Game, one word. I'm the solo developer of it, and if you want to help out, then you can wishlist Garden Story on Steam.
Yay. Awesome.
Thanks for everything,
Yes,
Jenny.
wishlist.
Yeah, no problem. This was fun
Thank
for me.
you.
And once again, my name's Jenny Wyndham. If you'd like to find me, I'm on Twitter at Kimchika25 and just Kimchika everywhere else, primarily in Twitch and TikTok now, which is interesting. Yeah, thank you everyone for stopping by. I hope you have a great LudoNarraCon and enjoy playing the demos, seeing all of the other panels and talks and speakers. And yeah, thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye, everyone.
LudoNarraCon.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
fellow
everyone.
traveler.
Yay.